Okay. Welcome everyone to the Jewish Studies Center. Who am I? I'm Jerry Garfinkel. I'm the treasurer and the technical director of the Jewish Studies Center. And you all will be at a great class after I'm speaking, at least, about Oppenheimer and Richard Strauss. As treasurer, I need to tell you that our classes are all free, but we do have expenses. And so we encourage people to give donations. We do not require them, but they're encouraged. And if you want to give a donation, go on to our website, www.jewishstudiescenter.org, and click on donate. And then you can click on either PayPal to give money from your PayPal account, or via a credit card, or a check. If you click on checking or check, it'll give you the address and where to send your check. Okay, that's my treasury questions, comments. As technical director, I wanted to say a few things. This class is being recorded. After the class is over, I will cut off the stuff that came before we actually started, and I will post the recording on YouTube, and I'll send an email to everybody who has registered for the class, so then you can look at the recording. Everybody is muted now, but we do want your questions and your comments, so put them in the chat. And after the presentation is over, we'll have a Q&A session, and I believe Mindy Reiser, who was our vice president, will run that. I think the closed captions are on now. I could be wrong, but I think it is. I see it myself, so I think it's on. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, who is Rabbi, physicist, Dr. Jack Shlachter. I love saying those three titles together. He is such a integrated type person, diverse type person. So he is a physicist PhD. As such, he has worked for 30 years, or maybe more, at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Now, remember that laboratory is the one that J. Robert Oppenheimer established in 1943, where the Manhattan Project was, that they developed the atom bomb. And Dr. Shlachter, now I'm saying, has had an extraordinary career there. I mean, for a number of years, he was chief of the experimental division, which is actually called the physics division. Oppenheimer called it physics. Everything by physics. Oppenheimer, I guess, was experimental. And then a few years later, he became Dr. Shlachter became the director of the theoretical division. So he's both experimental and theoretical, and he's been there for many years, etc. Okay, that's the physicist type. Now he's also a rabbi. So what happened there? When he came to Los Alamos, he became a lay leader at the local synagogue, Los Alamos Jewish Center. And then later on, 1996, I believe, he received smicha from the Jewish Theological Society. So he's now a certified conservative rabbi. And he's currently the rabbi both of the Los Alamos synagogue, but also synagogue in Santa Fe named HaMakom, the place. And for the last few years, he's been doing high holiday services at all kinds of far away places, like Beijing for 5 years, Warsaw, Vienna, and he just came back a month or so ago from Bangkok. So he's a traveling rabbi. So I'm going to now, if I can find them, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi, Dr. Physicist Jack Shlachter.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I'm absolutely thrilled to be participating in the Jewish Study Center series. It's a fantastic series, and I've had the pleasure, and I really mean it. It's been a pleasure to get to communicate with Jerry Garfinkel and with Mindy Reiser. You couldn't ask for nicer people to be working with. So I just wanted to put a plug in for the Jewish Studies Center and for the really dedicated volunteers who keep this program going. I also see a bunch of friends who have logged on to watch this presentation, and it's really quite flattering that you would spend time to come to this program today. And I hope you enjoy it. I hope that you learn something from it as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully this will work. Let's see what happens. Thank you for your patience. I am going to give a presentation about the Jewish perspective on the relationship between two individuals, and the individuals are Louis Strauss and J. Robert Oppenheimer. And Louis Strauss pronounced his name that way, so we're gonna pronounce his name as Strauss, even though I think it probably looks like it says Strauss to most people. Um, so, oh, I see. I keep. Okay. I'm just trying to hide my floating meeting controls. Let's see if we can keep that way. All right. So this presentation came about because it was known that there was a movie coming out about Oppenheimer in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where I live and where I worked for many years at the laboratory here. And as Jerry said, that's the laboratory where the first atomic bomb was designed. And I also serve as the rabbi of the congregation here in Los Alamos, as well as a small congregation in Santa Fe. But it was known that a movie about Oppenheimer was going to come out in the summer of 2023. And there was a series of talks that were arranged by the Oppenheimer Memorial Committee that were about Oppenheimer. And I was asked to give a talk about Oppenheimer and his Judaism because I am the rabbi here in Los Alamos. So I thought, well, I don't really want to talk just about Oppenheimer and his Judaism, but I thought it'd be a more interesting story to talk about Oppenheimer and Louis Strauss and the fact that they were both Jewish. And I put together this presentation, and I gave this presentation 10 days before the movie came out, not knowing that it would actually be an important part of the movie to talk about the relationship between Strauss and Oppenheimer. So I was very fortunate that I latched onto this topic in advance of the movie coming out. And if you haven't seen the movie, I encourage you to see it. The movie won the Best Picture Award, it won the Best Director Award, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actor, Best Cinematography, Best Film Editing, and Best Original Score. It was quite successful in winning all of those things. So it's, I think, a very good movie. It's what I would call quite accurate, to the best I understand it, about the story of the development of the bomb, and also about the story after the war, 1954, when there was a clash between two individuals, Louis Strauss and J. Robert Oppenheimer, and that resulted in Oppenheimer losing his security clearance. So there was clearly some tension between these two individuals, and if you explore why Louis Strauss and Oppenheimer didn't get along with each other. Number one, there was a political aspect to this. Oppenheimer was very much associated with very left-leaning causes during his life. Whether he was actually a member of the Communist Party or not has been debated, but he had very close friends, his brother, his wife, who were members of the Communist Party at one point in their lives. And so he was very left-leaning. Strauss, on the other hand, was very anti-communist. So that was clearly one of the bases for the hostility between the two. There was also disagreement over the development of a hydrogen bomb. Let's see if I can, again, hide my... Okay. So they disagreed about whether a hydrogen bomb should be developed after World War II was over. There was also some interaction between the two individuals over who was going to be the director of the Institute for Advanced Studies, which was an institution that Oppenheimer ended up leading after World War II. But Strauss himself, who was on the board of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, was in the running to be the director as well. So I suspect that was part of the tension between the two individuals also. There were other reasons that they clashed. After World War II, in 1949, Louis Strauss was a member of the Atomic Energy Commission, and J. Robert Oppenheimer was an advisor to that committee. And there was a public humiliation of Louis Strauss that took place when Oppenheimer was criticizing Strauss for his lack of knowledge of physics. It had to do with the export of radioisotopes, and Oppenheimer, rather than being diplomatic about it, he ended up making Strauss feel quite humiliated, and Strauss was not one to forget a humiliation. There was also some jealousy, I think, on Strauss's part, because Oppenheimer grew up quite wealthy. He grew up in a very well-to-do household, whereas Strauss experienced some impoverishment as he was growing up because his family lost their money during a depression in the early 1900s. So there was some jealousy there. Also, Strauss himself was pretty straight-laced, I would say, and Oppenheimer had some adulterous affairs, and I think that might have been a sticking point between the two of them. But last but not least was their identification with their Judaism, and that's really the dimension that I want to talk about. I'm not trying to argue that this was the most important thing.
Warm tea after a while. No, you don't really have to take it.
Someone has muted Rabbi Shlachter.
I see. Now I just unmuted. Thank you. Okay, so let me move on because I think that will help us out. Let's see. So here's an outline for the talk. I'm going to introduce these two characters. I'm going to identify some of their traits. I'm going to summarize I'm going to talk a little bit about Judaism in general and Judaism in this country, and Temple Emmanuel in New York is going to play a significant role. So I will be talking about that institution. I'm going to talk about the connection that each of these individuals had to their Judaism, quite different and probably one dimension of the conflict between the two. And then I'm going to close with some historical document that I uncovered in the process of doing the research for this presentation. So here are our protagonists in this story. if I can do this correctly. There we go. There's the protagonists of our story of the summer of 2023. Oppenheimer on the left, but no, that's not Louis Strauss on the right. That is Barbie. Two movies I happened to see, amazingly enough. But there is Strauss. No, that's actually Levi Strauss. So close, we're getting closer, but finally there is Louis Strauss. So we have these two individuals, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the scientific lead of the Manhattan Project, which developed the first atomic bombs. J. Robert Oppenheimer on the left, and I've deliberately put him on the left here because of his political leanings. But also he's a very important figure scientifically in this story. He served as the chairman of the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission after the war. So from 1947 to 1952, Oppenheimer, so after the war, Oppenheimer continued to provide information to the Atomic Energy Commission, 1947 to 1952. And Strauss, on the other hand, was not involved in the Manhattan Project during the war. He had no connection to Los Alamos. He didn't know about Los Alamos, the secret town where the bomb was developed. But after the war, Strauss, who was a successful businessman, a quite wealthy businessman, he was appointed as a member of the Atomic Energy Commission, and between 1953 and 1958, Strauss was actually the chair of the Atomic Energy Commission. And it was during that period, and supposedly it was one of the preconditions for Strauss to become the chair, that he wanted Oppenheimer removed from any position of authority. He wanted Oppenheimer to lose his security clearance. And he, in fact, orchestrated to have that happen in 1954. I would say that the connection that these two individuals had to their Judaism was incredibly different, and probably was one element of the reason that they were in conflict. And yet there were some areas where they were quite similar. They both had a passion for physics. Oppenheimer went on to become a PhD physicist, and a physicist of quite importance. Strauss, in fact, never went to college. He was interested in physics in high school, but his family lost their money, and Strauss never went to college. His family was strapped, and Strauss went off and was a traveling shoe salesman when he would have been a college student. And he sent money home. It was quite important that he work that way, but he never went back to go to college. And I think he resented that he had missed that opportunity, but he did have an interest in physics. Another important dimension is that Strauss and Oppenheimer both were descendants of German Jews. Oppenheimer's father came to the United States from Germany as a teenager in 1888. Strauss's grandparents came to the United States in the 1830s and 1840s. So both came from this German Jewish background. And they had a lot of interactions after the war because Oppenheimer was the director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and Strauss was he was a trustee of the Institute for Advanced Studies. So let's look at some more about the two of them. And I keep hiding these controls, but I guess every time somebody comes in, my controls show up again. I just want to say that I'm quite intrigued about Jews with a connection to the Manhattan Project, so that's independent of the Oppenheimer-Strauss story. Every name on this list, and these are all incredibly gifted scientists, every name on these lists are Jewish scientists, and had something to do with the Manhattan Project, either in its conception or actually working on the project. The first four names there, really, I would say, in the conception of the Manhattan Project. And the first name, Lisa Meitner, the only woman on this list. So I wanted to single her out because she had an important role to play in understanding the process that led to the development of the first atomic bombs. Let me show you a little bit about the two individuals of importance here, Oppenheimer and Strauss, based on some poetry that they each wrote when they were young. The poem on the left by Oppenheimer, written when he was 19, the poem on the right, written by Strauss when he was 23. And you get a feeling for the difference in their personalities. The Oppenheimer poem, to me, sounds very ethereal. When the celestial saffron is faded and grown colorless, and the sun gone sterile, and the growing fire stirs us to waken. The poem by Strauss, on the other hand, has quite a righteous indignation tone to it. The blood of Maccabees runs in my veins. So talking about the story of Hanukkah, but with this smiting the foes of God and righteousness. And I think you learn a little bit about their personalities from these early poems that they each happen to write. Oppenheimer is notorious for having worn a pork pie hat, and I just couldn't resist, since we're talking about their Jewish identities, saying that, of all the hats that Oppenheimer could have chosen, maybe pork pie wouldn't be the one to choose if you were trying to stress your Jewish identity. In fact, Oppenheimer's relationship with Judaism was at the very best conflicted. He had a lifelong ambivalence about his Jewish identity. His parents felt themselves to be German immigrants and that they were striving to be American. So although they were ethnically and culturally Jewish, they never belonged to a synagogue. Judaism appears to have played no role whatsoever in Oppenheimer's household. And he grew up uneasy about his Jewishness. His friend Rabbi, the physicist Rabbi, said that Oppenheimer was Jewish, but he wished he weren't. And I think that's actually very important. Oppenheimer grew up in a household that I said had wealth. There were Picasso paintings, Rembrandt, Renoir, and Van Gogh paintings in the place where Oppenheimer grew up. That was not true for Strauss. I mentioned Rabbi. I just want to touch on him briefly. He was played in the movie by David Krumholtz, who is a Jewish actor. And I should have mentioned that if you've seen the movie, then you know Oppenheimer was played by Cillian Murphy and Strauss was played by Robert Downey Jr., but Robbie was actually played by a Jewish actor, David Krumholtz. He was my favorite character in the movie, and he befriended Oppenheimer, but he recognized that Oppenheimer was in some ways trying to suppress his Judaism, whereas Robbie was quite open about his Jewishness, even though he was probably not a believer, if you will, but he admitted and was proud of his Jewish connections. So let me go on to talk about Judaism briefly. I think Judaism, for many people, is a religion. And yet, I think that is a little bit odd because when you think about it, there are militant atheists who are Jews. So even though it's been described as a religion, it's also been described as a culture and a nationality. And for me, I think Jews are best described as an extended family. And so, like a family, we don't always agree with each other. We argue a lot. If you're Jewish, you know what I'm talking about. But also, when somebody does something shameful, we feel shame. And when somebody does something prideful, we feel proud of it. So how did Jews end up in the United States in the first place? Well, Jews were expelled from Spain, of course, in 1492, and the first Jews settled in New Amsterdam in 1654. The first synagogue wasn't established in North America until 1730. And the first rabbi didn't come to America until 1840. So I like to think of that as the 110 golden years of Judaism in the United States, because you could safely come to a synagogue and not have to worry about having a rabbi speaking to you. So Jews came to the country and had relatively small numbers early on. I'm going to show you something about the population, but first let's go on with a few more dates. 1881. This was pogroms in Russia following the assassination of Alexander II. And it's very unfortunate, but that's what led to the mass exodus of Jews from Eastern Europe between 1881 and 1924, which is when the Immigration Act stopped the flow of Jews to this country. Most Jews in this country are, in fact, descendants of people who came during that period, 1881 to 1924. That's not the case for Oppenheimer or Strauss. So you see orders of magnitude here of Jewish population in this country, 2,000 in 1790, but then an order of magnitude more by 1840, another order of magnitude more by 1880. And that's the wave of German Jewish immigrants that is the story of both Oppenheimer and Strauss. And then, finally, in 1880 to 1920, we have the bulk of Jews coming to this country, 2.5 million Jews coming from Eastern Europe, and making up the bulk of Jews today in this country. 5.5 million or 5.7 million Jews in this country, about 1.7% of Americans are Jewish. So I said that Temple Emmanuel was going to play a role. In the upper left here, you see a loft, which is the first home of Temple Emmanuel that was established in 1845 on the Lower East Side in New York City by 33 Jews. That was 1845, but by 1868, many of those German Jews had become wealthy, and the congregation built this beautiful Moorish-designed building in the lower left at 5th Avenue and East 43rd Street. And then after a merger of another New York City congregation with Temple Emmanuel opened its current building, 1927, this magnificent structure at 5th Avenue and 65th Street on the Upper East Side. It was the largest synagogue in the world when it was built, and in fact, it seats more people than St. Patrick's Cathedral 10 blocks to the south. It was designed by Jewish architects, and it was making a bold statement that the Jews of New York City were part of mainstream American life and had reached the upper echelons. So people were proud, if you will, to be Jewish. Now, the story takes a twist, because when Temple Emmanuel was established, in 1857, they invited Samuel Adler to come from Germany to be the first rabbi. So he led the synagogue, and you can see that Felix Adler, his son, was born in 1851, and so he was only 6 years old when the family came from Germany to the United States. And because everyone needed to be educated in Germany if they wanted to be at the top of their game, Felix was sent back to Germany to be educated when he was of college age, and he went on to win his PhD from Heidelberg in Germany. But while Felix Adler was in Germany, he was influenced by Kant, he was influenced by Karl Marx. And when Felix Adler came back in 1874 at the age of 23 with his PhD, he was being groomed to be his father's successor as the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel. He gave a sermon, And in that sermon, which was, as I say, influenced by the philosophy of Kant and by the teachings of Karl Marx, Felix Adler never mentioned God even once in that sermon. That was the first sermon that he gave at Temple Emmanuel. It was also the last sermon that he gave at Temple Emmanuel. And so Felix Adler broke off from Temple Emmanuel. He created something called the Society of Ethical Culture, and then in conjunction with this Society of Ethical Culture, he created a school called the Ethical Culture School. And this played a very important role in our story. Julius Oppenheimer, the father of J. Robert Oppenheimer, was a trustee of the Ethical Culture Society. Felix Adler actually conducted the wedding ceremony of J. Robert Oppenheimer's parents, Julius and Ella, and J. Robert Oppenheimer was educated at the Ethical Culture School. So he absorbed the teachings of Felix Adler, of Karl Marx. You can see where the left-leaning associations were, and this had a huge effect on J. Robert Oppenheimer. So Oppenheimer really did not have much connection to his Judaism. These are a few things that you could say if you really had to search for a connection between Oppenheimer and his Judaism. Oppenheimer did put some of his own money into helping Jewish scientists emigrate starting in 1934. He did help some of his relatives emigrate in 1937. And he experienced some anti-Semitism even after the war, when he was probably the most famous scientist in the United States, excepting for Einstein. Oppenheimer was prevented from getting a position at Caltech because, or at least he wasn't immediately invited to Caltech, because the president of the university, Robert Millikan, thought maybe there were enough Jews on the faculty already. Nevertheless, there really weren't many connections between Oppenheimer and his Judaism. It was said of Oppenheimer that he was, this is a quote, that Oppenheimer tried to act as if he were not a Jew, and he succeeded well because he was a good actor. So he really tried to distance himself from his Judaism. Now, to contrast that, Strauss, in his early years, during World War I, he volunteered to help Herbert Hoover, who was in charge of European relief efforts, and Strauss was very insistent that Hoover, despite Hoover's prejudice against Jews, that Hoover intercede on behalf of Jews. And then Strauss went on, as he acquired wealth, Strauss went on to serve as the president of that very synagogue that broke off into the Ethical Culture School. Strauss was the president of Temple Emmanuel between 1938 and 1948. Strauss really was proud of his Judaism, but he had to navigate in a world where Jews were trying hard to fit in. Rabbi, who I mentioned earlier, once said of Oppenheimer that Oppenheimer couldn't make up his mind whether he wanted to be president of the B'nai B'rith, a Jewish organization, or president of the Knights of Columbus, clearly not a Jewish organization. So I think that it's pretty clear that Oppenheimer was at the very least conflicted about his Judaism. Strauss, on the other hand, really was quite visible as the president of the largest synagogue in the United States. And Strauss was probably not an easy person to get along with. It was said of Strauss by the scientist Emilio Segre that Strauss spoke with God, and I didn't like him. So he was probably a pretty strong personality. In Strauss's autobiography, he quotes from Jewish texts extensively. Every chapter has a quotation from a Jewish text, and I understand that when he chaired the Atomic Energy Commission, he opened the first meeting with a prayer. I can't imagine Oppenheimer doing something like that. So, Oppenheimer, born 1904, died 1967. Grew up in a very fine art and culture environment. He was a student at the Ethical Culture Society School, and he learned about New Mexico as a child because he was sent out to New Mexico to recuperate. He had grown up in New York, but he came out to New Mexico, and he fell in love with New Mexico. So when there was the opportunity to decide where to put the secret laboratory to build the bomb, Oppenheimer was instrumental in that decision to make the laboratory located in New Mexico. Here you see him with his pork pie hat in this picture of the preparations for the first test of the atomic bomb in southern New Mexico. And just I'll point out that this individual here is Louis Slotin, who was another Jewish scientist associated with the project, who stayed in Los Alamos after the war and died tragically in a horrific radiation accident. If we're lucky here, I'm going to see if we can listen to Oppenheimer. Let's see if we can get this thing queued up correctly. Hang on just one second. Here we go.
Robert Oppenheimer realized the grave responsibilities of our new knowledge.
Science has profoundly altered the conditions of man's life, both materially and in ways of the spirit as well. It has extended the range of questions in which man has a choice. It has extended man's freedom to make significant decisions. No one can predict what vast new continents of knowledge the future of science will discover. But we know that as long as men are free to ask what they will, free to say what they think, free to think what they must, science will never regress, and freedom itself will never be wholly lost.
The application of this to Robert Oppenheimer realized the
So you heard a clip of Oppenheimer from 1950 when he was an extremely respected physicist in this country. This was after the war and after he had had such a great success leading the scientific part of the Manhattan Project. I want to show you a little bit about Strauss now. Strauss, born about 8 years earlier than Oppenheimer, died in 1974. He was born in West Virginia. He actually grew up mostly in Virginia. That's the reason for this pronunciation of Strauss. He was a very smart individual, and as I said, he was very interested in physics. He was the valedictorian of his high school, but he was unable to pursue advanced studies, didn't go to college because of the impoverishment of his family. He was exposed to communism in 1919 when he saw the effects of the Polish-Soviet War, and he developed a lifelong anti-communist sentiment, and that certainly played a role in his conflict with Oppenheimer. So let me show you a little more about Strauss. Here he is as a member of the Atomic Energy Commission, the 5 members of the Atomic Energy Commission shown here with the chairman, David Lilienthal, a Jewish individual, and this is Robert Bacher on the left, the only physicist on the commission. And this is Strauss, and I like to say with this picture, Strauss is on the far right, and that's true both politically as well as in the image. There were several dozen instances where the commission voted on information security matters. and Strauss was a minority of one in every one of those votes. And he was perceived as being very stubborn, that the other members of the commission were not as worried about information security, and Strauss himself voted against them. He was a highly successful investment banker during the 20s and 30s. And that's where he acquired his wealth. That's when he became prominent with Temple Emmanuel. And as I say, he was the president of Temple Emmanuel from 1938 to 1948. During World War II, he was a rear admiral, and his job was trying to help motivate plants to produce more munitions. So he didn't have any connection to the Manhattan Project, probably didn't even know Oppenheimer during the war. Here you see a picture of Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower in the middle, Strauss on the left, being sworn in 1958 as the interim interim secretary of the Commerce. Eisenhower put Strauss's name forward as the Secretary of Commerce, and then Strauss was actually not confirmed by the Senate. If you saw the movie, you saw the scenes of the voting for Strauss and the voting against Strauss, and part of that political battle was just Democrats trying to regain some power against a Republican president. But part of it is that people were upset that Strauss had sort of manufactured the situation so that Oppenheimer lost his clearance. So Strauss was the driving force in the revocation of Oppenheimer's security clearance. I don't know that that was the only reason that the Senate did not confirm Strauss. There were some issues associated with the Tennessee Valley Authority and with private enterprise making nuclear reactors in this country, but it probably was one dimension. I'd like you to listen to Strauss for just a moment. He's going to say something about science speaking in many tongues.
Get away!
Whoops. What happened there? Let's try that again. Whoop. One more time.
Science speaks in many tongues. The advancement of the nuclear arts has been the work of men of many nations. The phenomenon of nuclear fission having been revealed to man, it is still left to him to determine the use to which it shall be.
So that was Strauss in 1956 when the United Nations delegates gathered to approve the creation of a new organization called the International Atomic Energy Agency. And Strauss was, I would say, at the peak of his game there in 1956. And he was the chair of the Atomic Energy Commission of the United States. Here he is shown in 1953 on the cover of Time magazine, and it says, United States atom boss Louis Strauss. So he's really considered a very important figure in the world of atomic energy in this country. 1953, now the chair of the Atomic Energy Commission. But as I said, he had apparently made it a precondition that Oppenheimer's security clearance be revoked, and that happened in 1954. Now, Strauss came up then in front of a Democratic Senate in 1959 as the proposed candidate to be the permanent Secretary of the Commerce. And here's Time magazine in 1959, where this time you see the Strauss affair And in fact, Strauss did not become the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, one of the very rare circumstances where somebody's confirmation was not made by the Senate. So Strauss, with this rise to power and then plummeting after this affair, never again really served in any important positions, though he didn't die until 1974. So a sort of a Greek tragedy story of a rise and a fall. And here on Time magazine covers, we see the same thing with Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer in 1948 on the cover, probably, considered one of the most familiar physics names in the country. And here you see him in 1948, and then losing his clearance. You see him here in 1954, which is, of course, the era of the McCarthy hearings and a lot of concern about anti-communism. And the caption of this Time magazine cover says, "Beyond loyalty, the harsh requirements of security." So it's been said by the biographer Ray Monk that Oppenheimer cannot be understood without taking into account the importance of his deeply felt desire to overcome the sense of being an outsider that he inherited from his German Jewish background. This desire lies at the root of the ambivalence toward his Jewish ancestry that was noted by many of his closest friends. And you saw that in the quotes from Rabbi as well. So it's my feeling that that these two individuals had a contrast in their connection to Judaism, and this is the historical document that I uncovered that got me interested in this story in the first place. This is a letter that was sent by the Los Alamos Jewish Center, the synagogue building having been built in 1963, and right after the death of Strauss, this letter was sent to his widow, well, to the family of Admiral Louis L. Strauss, by the president of the Los Alamos Jewish Center, Katz, and it says the Los Alamos Jewish Center was deeply saddened to hear of the recent passing of Admiral Strauss. In appreciation for his early and enthusiastic support of our group, we are dedicating a series of books in the center library to his memory. We hope these books will serve as a fitting memorial to a great friend of our community. So what's going on here? Louis Strauss made sure that the Los Alamos Jewish Center could build their building by helping them secure a zero-interest loan from Temple Emmanuel in New York because of his close connections with Temple Emmanuel. And I thought when I saw this document that this was really interesting because the scuttlebutt in Los Alamos was always that Oppenheimer was God, basically, and Strauss was the devil, and that there was, nothing good about Strauss and nothing bad about Oppenheimer. But when I read this letter and I realized what role Strauss had played in establishing the Jewish community in Los Alamos, I realized that the Jewish dimension of the clash between Oppenheimer and Strauss was probably part of what led to this tragic saga of both individuals. So I close by saying that perhaps now you won't see the Oppenheimer-Strauss battle quite as black and white as before. I think the clash between the two of them in some sense was a clash between ethical humanism and ethical monotheism, and so I've pushed their pictures a little bit closer together. I hope you realize that there is nuance in any relationship and that there really were dimensions to the Jewish connections that these individuals had that played a role in the story. So I appreciate your patience and thank you for your attention, and I just posed the question, could the rehabilitation of Edward Teller be next on the agenda? You saw Edward Teller portrayed in the movie as well. Edward Teller, also a fierce anti-communist who really had it in for Oppenheimer, and you saw part of that story in the movie. So here's some acknowledgments and references. I show my appreciation to people who helped me put this talk together. I list the book American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin. That's what was the basis for the Oppenheimer movie. several other books here that I used in the course of putting this together. And at the bottom here, my email address and my website, physicsrabbi@gmail.com and www.physicsrabbi.com. And I hope that you learned something from this presentation. And thank you for your attention.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Jack. That was great. And I hadn't really seen your presentation before. I've spoken to you a few times, and some of the things that you mentioned, really, really got to me. I visited Trinity Place, where the first atom bomb was tested. So that's a little, it was at White Sands where I used to work. And I had no idea that Oppenheimer was related in any way to the Ethical Society, because my synagogue, my chevra for Brengen, davens at the Washington Ethical Society. And
really, okay,
and I'm organizing a joint event with them and a Muslim group that meets in the same building next month, and I'll bring up this connection between Oppenheimer and Ethical Society. It's really, all these weird things happen. Mindy, are you on? You want to do the Q&A part after I give my silly remarks?
Very much silly. Again, incredible enthusiasm for the presentation, really rave reviews, but that's not surprising. Okay, I want to...
You're invisible.
I have a magic cloak. I might take it off one day, but not now. Okay, I don't know if you can speak in any detail, Jack, but can you say something about the actual process of the revocation of the security clearance? How did that work? It must have been some sort of bureaucratic maneuvering. Was there a hearing? Was there much publicity about what was happening? Did the media get involved? That's a fascinating story beyond the shared Jewish heritage, but then how this actually played out in the revocation.
Yeah, I don't know that story so well. People who have seen the movie probably saw what I saw about the hearings. I think it was a closed hearing. I don't think the media was involved. I don't think it was a fair hearing. I think that the defense didn't have access to the same information that the prosecution had, and so what ultimately happened, and people should be aware of this, the whole procedure was vacated a few years ago. What that means in a technical sense is that it's as if it never happened. And this came about because of the efforts of many individuals, but in particular, all of the living laboratory directors signed a letter requesting that the Secretary of Energy vacate the hearing. And so that was finally done. You can't actually give somebody their clearance back if they're dead. So, and it didn't really make sense to try to give Oppenheimer his clearance back for a variety of reasons. But the proceedings were very unfair, let's say. And so what I do know about it is that they were not open hearings, and there was not really a fair process that was involved.
Do we have any unsealed records of the hearing itself?
I think the proceedings are all now public. That's my understanding.
Okay. Now, going back to the Jewish dimension specifically, do you have any insight as to how the non-Jewish scientists at Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project, dealt with the many Jewish scientists involved? Was there any animosity? Were people interested in Jewish culture and history because of the presence of these Jewish scientists?
Yeah, those are great questions. Again, I'm only guessing a bit at an answer to this. Mostly the Jewish scientists at Los Alamos during the war were working on the project. There was not what I would call a robust Jewish community. I spoke with some individuals who were here during the time of the Manhattan Project. I would guess that virtually all of them have passed away now, but I spoke with some of them while they were still alive, and it doesn't sound like there was a lot of Jewish activity during the war. I know of Jewish individuals who went down to Santa Fe, which is about a 35-mile drive, when they would go for high holiday services in the fall. I've read about some services that were conducted during the Manhattan Project era, but I don't know any real details about that. There's an individual who is cited as having led some of the services during the war. But I think people were really, and people should understand, the real enemy as the people were working on this project was the Germans. And I think everybody was pitching in to fight the Germans by developing a bomb before the Germans could develop a bomb. And I don't think there was no obvious signs of anti-Semitism that I'm aware of during the Manhattan Project era.
Okay, here's a question from one of the members of the audience, and I have it as well. Why was this man, Strauss, originally appointed to the AEC? You mentioned he was interested in physics. Well, that's great, but there are surely hundreds of people, if not thousands, who were much better qualified than he was.
So actually, the Atomic Energy Commission, as I believe is the case, only had the one physicist on it, Robert Bacher, who went on to become the chair of the physics department at Caltech when I was a student at Caltech. But I think the other individuals were just considered well-connected individuals. Strauss had donated a fair amount of money to the Republican Party. He was visible in the Republican Party. He was very connected with Hoover for many years, starting when he was young. I think he went into Hoover's office unannounced and just said, "I'd like to work for you on these European relief efforts." And they were friends for the rest of Hoover's life. And he was supportive of Eisenhower as well. So how he got appointed, I don't know, but money does grease some skids, and he was a smart individual too, and a successful businessman. So I really can't speak to the details of his getting those positions, but he was not the only non-scientist on the commission.
That's helpful. Okay, there's interest in the actual face-to-face dealings of Oppenheimer and Strauss. How many times do they actually sit next to each other or around a big table, talking with each other in a civil manner? Was there much physical interaction between them?
I don't know for sure. And if we discount the hearings where clearly Oppenheimer was present, they must have had several interactions because Oppenheimer was the director of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, and Strauss was a trustee. So I would suspect they had some interactions in conjunction with the Institute. But I don't know any details about that. Like I say, I think it was 1949 when Strauss was a member of the Atomic Energy Commission. That's when Oppenheimer ridiculed Strauss publicly. And I can tell a little bit about that story because it's interesting. Strauss's parents both died of cancer in the 30s, I believe. And Strauss believed that radioisotopes could have saved their lives, that radioisotope therapy might have prevented them from dying of cancer. So he was very interested in radioisotopes. When Oppenheimer was questioned publicly must have been some kind of like a Senate hearing or something. He was questioned by Strauss whether it was really a good idea to have radioisotopes just be sent to other countries, because couldn't somebody build bombs with radioisotopes? Oppenheimer laughed at Strauss and basically exposed his ignorance of the physics of radioisotopes. And Strauss was not one to forget that kind of humiliation. That was in 1949. So then in 1954, he had the opportunity to turn the tables. How many other interactions they had between 1949 and 1954, I don't know, but surely they had some, because of Oppenheimer's role as the chair of the advisory committee to the Atomic Energy Commission, and also his role as the director of the Institute for Advanced Studies. But that's a very interesting question. Again, I should have said this up front. I am not a historian. I just got interested in this particular story, and we'd have to ask some professionals for more information about that.
For a non-professional historian, I think you do a very good job. And now here's a kind of $64 million question, which is really a philosophical question. And you can answer, unfortunately, in just a few minutes. Discuss the relationship between physics, religion, and belief in God.
Okay, that's while standing on one foot is the way the Talmud would pose that question. Of course, what I can say is I know what works for me, and what works for me is that as a physicist, I have the privilege of looking at the universe with a physicist's eye, and I see tremendous beauty in the universe. And maybe that's the best I can say that I understand about the divine, is that there's just so much beauty in nature, in the way the universe works, that I don't find the same conflict between, if you would call it, faith and science, or Judaism and physics. I don't see that same conflict that others see. But I don't think of myself as a very deep thinker in this regard, and I've managed to somehow maneuver through life without any real conflicts in these two parts of my life, my love of physics and my love of Judaism. They seem maybe in some ways to be synergistic rather than in conflict. I happen to be in a program right now through a wonderful organization called Sinai and Synapses, and it looks at this intersection, if you will, between faith and science. And I'm in a program, and hopefully will be able to contribute in some meaningful way to that program, because I happen to have this dual hat, if you will, or dual kippah, I suppose you could call it.
Can't get away without saying more about this fascinating project. Who was behind it, and what are their objectives in launching it?
I think it's really in part educational. It's under the auspices of CLAL, which is a large umbrella organization based in New York. I think that Sinai and Synapses is a program under CLAL that, and I'm probably misstating this and somebody should correct me, but Sinai and Synapses does things in congregations. They bring leaders together. The program I'm involved in, we meet 3 times a year for 2 years in New York, and we've only met once, and our speaker at that one meeting was from the National Academies, and no, from the AAAS, I think, from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And you know, I think we're looking at that intersection and trying to find ways to help people navigate that intersection. But it's a very good program.
Well, I think they will get some inquiries from your mentioning it tonight. I would be sure of
Yeah,
that.
people should feel free to email me. Again, it's physicsrabbi@gmail.com. And in particular, it'll give me an opportunity to fix all the mistakes that I made tonight and to answer the questions that I can't answer while standing on one foot.
And I'll bet that people will find you in New Mexico when they get there. So you may have other chances to talk with them. Okay, Jerry, let me pass this over to you, unless, Jack, you would like to say a few words in closing.
I just want to say thank you to the Jewish Study Center and to you, Mindy, and to you, Jerry, as well. You're a dream to work with, and I super enjoyed the opportunity to present here.
So glad that you could make the time for it, Jerry. Jerry is somewhere here. I know he wants to say a few words in closing.
To unmute myself. We need to thank you, but before I go on, there was someone who had her hand up. She took it down now, so I don't know who it was. In response to what you were saying about, physics and divinity and stuff, I do like many things about your presentation and stuff, and I like your title that in your email, the nuclear rabbi. So, yeah, that's another good one. I very much enjoyed it. And if you look at the chat, I'll send it just in a minute. Anita, do you want to say something? I'll let you unmute, and you might want to put your camera on so we can see you. I'm allowing you to
All
unmute.
I want to know is there a way to get a copy of this?
Yeah, there will be a recording. I was about to say that, so you don't have to ask that question.
Fine, then.
I will be editing this thing just to cut off the part that was recorded before the class began, and I will post the recording on YouTube, and I'll send an email to everyone. And when I send the email, Jack, you can give me some stuff that I can include in the email, including any mistakes you might possibly potentially have made. I don't think there were any, but you can do that. And so there will be some information in the email besides the link to the recording. It'll also include Jack's email, and I hope to include also those references Jack put in the back, in the end of the presentation. So there'll be various information pieces in the email besides the link to the recording. Someone else had a question. Ina, would you want to put your camera on? You can speak now if you want. I'm asking you to unmute, so it's not doing it. Okay. I don't know what the problem is, but okay. So let me once again, I probably should meet twice again. Thank you, Jack, for a wonderful talk, and maybe we'll talk about Edward Teller at some point in the future. Edward Teller, besides being an opponent of Oppenheimer, was considered the father of the HaMakom. So he went one step further than Oppenheimer did. Next week, we're having a class about this fellow named Darius Milhaud, who is a great composer, Jewish composer, whom I had never heard of before. But the class is by Seth Keibel, and Seth assures me that he will become my favorite Jewish composer. And I've heard from other people who do know of his work, and they're all very impressed. I'm not sure what's going to happen in 2 weeks from now. We had been arranging a class about the Portuguese Moranos, but I've been expanding that class into a complete history, a history, not complete, but of the Sephardic Jews. The Moranos are part of the Sephardic Jews. And by the way, some of the Sephardic Jews were crypto Jews, and many of them were in New Mexico. There's another New Mexico connection with that. So next week, we're having a great class about Darius Milhaud, and I will send out emails about the recording, and I'll also send out emails about what our future classes will be. And thank you for the third or fourth time. I'm not sure which it is, Jack. I think we're gonna close it at this point. Exactly in time.
Thank